Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three specific topics. The first one is going to be the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. The second one is we're going to review this year's budget that was announced a couple of weeks ago. And lastly, we're going to talk about the approved mission to our borders by the European Union. Let's start with the Artsakh blockade. The blockade has actually passed its 50-day mark. Obviously, every day that goes by, the situation is becoming more dire and acute as far as people not being able to meet their daily needs. The International Red Cross has been organizing family reunifications. A group of kids that were stuck here since Eurovision were taken back to their families in Artsakh. This week, the International Court of Justice, which is the main court of the United Nations, heard Armenia's case for interim measures against the Aliyev regime for its illegal blockade of Artsakh. Armenia's case, which was, rather strong and made very well by the legal team representing Armenia, cited that these actions are actually based on discriminatory and racial ethnic grounds, which is actually true, and made the very clear case that the purpose here and the end goal of the Aliyev regime is ethnic cleansing and nothing else. Following that, there was the court heard the counter case, the suit that was filed by the Aliyev regime, a very frivolous one, which essentially accuses Armenia of transporting mines through the Lachin corridor. Now, just to understand how absurd this is, the basis of their case is that Armenia is laying mines in territory that it doesn't control, which is obviously absurd on the face of it. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is to review the budget and the specifics of the budget that was announced a few weeks back by the government. This would be the 2023 budget. This coming year's budget is $6.6 billion. This is in comparison to the 2018 budget, which was $3.8 billion, and all of these numbers are actually in 2022 dollars. Part of these numbers have actually adjusted upwards on both of these cases because of the appreciation of the drum against the dollar when over the course of the last year, because of too many dollars coming into the country, the drum has actually appreciated from somewhere about in the 500 to the dollar range to somewhere in the 400 to the dollar range. This growth in the budget is essentially driven by two factors. The very strong economic growth that we've had over the last few years, except for 2020, which was the year of COVID and the war. And obviously much better tax collection, which, a lot of people who were not paying their taxes when we had a far more oligarchic economic system have actually paid their taxes, which has actually grown our budget dramatically. One example of this, which is the most important item for me, is military spending, which is up 110% from the previous year. This year's military budget is going to be $1,280,000,000. The budget itself, if you look at the spending, is about 27% of GDP. And this is sort of a gauge of where you're at in the world. This is actually low by developed world standards because in most Western countries, especially European ones, the budget is about somewhere between 35 to 50% of GDP, 50% being on the high end. But it also shows that you're moving in the right direction. Another piece of economic news which came out yesterday, which was quite interesting and actually quite telling, was private sector wage growth, which is up about 25% last year. Some of it driven by making up for the fact that we have inflation rate officially in the 8% range. But I think, as with anywhere, inflation is actually understated. It's probably much more than that. But I think we still have wage growth in the private sector that is running faster than inflation, which obviously has the effect of raising living standards. Now let's put all of these numbers in perspective. Obviously, having more budget, having more money to spend on your budget and economic growth are all good things. But we need to put this in perspective. The growth that we're having today, we should have been having 10 years ago. The above $6 billion budget that we have today, we should have had 10 years ago. The above $1 billion military budget that we have today, we should have had 10 years ago. And the progress that we're making today on the economic front, which is real and tangible, we should have had 10 years ago. Now, I know some of you are sitting at home going, why is he talking about these things when we have these existential issues in Artsakh, on defense and other matters? But I will tell you how these things are exactly connected, because at the end of the day, the strength of any country actually comes from its economic prospects. We are where we are today in Artsakh and our borders for many reasons, and there's many at fault. But primarily, that is driven by the fact that we never created a proper economy and a proper state, and a proper defense system that can defend the people of Artsakh and Armenia. At the end of the day, if you don't want to be weak, don't be poor. Now we're going to move on to the third topic of the week, the last one, which is about the announced EU mission or monitoring mission to Armenia's borders. This was announced last Monday. That there's going to be, these numbers are conflicting, that we've gotten somewhere between 100 or 200 border monitors. They're going to be monitoring all of Armenians' borders on behalf of the European Union over the next 2 years. In and of itself, this is actually quite a positive development. Now, this 2-year time period is critical, is because it's likely to be longer than that. They went into Georgia, this monitoring missions for the EU in 2008, and almost a decade later, they're still there, which is likely going to be the case here. Obviously, these monitors do not prevent or take away the threat of attacks or invasions by the Aliyev regime. But however, they do raise the political costs for any such actions. On an interesting side note, which has been noted by few, was a very interesting tweet by a French senator named Bruno Retailleau with the following information, which is that as part of this 100 or 200 person EU mission, there's going to be 70 French gendarmes that are going to be part of this mission. Now, why is this important? The gendarmerie in France, contrary to most people's understanding, is actually not part of the police, is actually a branch of the military. Now, if these facts are actually correct, and we have not had this confirmed by anybody else outside of this one French senator, this would be the first time that there's non-Russian troops that have been stationed in Armenia in the post-independence period, which would be a ground-breaking political and military development. Now let's look at what the response has been from the Aliyev regime and the Russian government. We'll start with the Aliyev regime. In an interview, Aliyev actually denounced this as a hostile and unfriendly act by the European Union. Let's comprehend what he's saying. He's saying that border monitors that are on the Armenian side of the border, not on his territory, are actually a threat to his country or an unfriendly act. He says the territory he has no control over and he has no legal claims to. Now, why is he saying this? Is because the fact that these monitors are there actually raises what he's actually interested in, which is further military aggression. Now, let's move on to what the Russian foreign ministry or foreign minister or different Russian officials have had to say. To be honest, their response can be described as nothing less than hysterical. In one of the releases of the Russian foreign ministry, they almost go to the point of threatening these EU peacekeepers if they ever, the EU monitors, if they ever come in contact with Russian troops or peacekeepers in Artsakh. Different Russian officials have attacked this mission as one, interfering with the Russian peacemaking process. They further went on to denounce the European Union as being nothing but the political arm of NATO. Third, they attacked the Armenian government for choosing EU monitors over CSTO monitors. And fourth, the most interesting one and the most telling one, they actually criticized this for not getting the approval of the Aliyev regime. Again, we need to have border monitors in our country. They want us to get approval from their ally in the Aliyev regime. Now let's move on to analyzing this, especially the Russian reaction. Frankly, if you look at the Russian reaction, it actually sounds a lot like an abusive husband that's been handed divorce paper by their long battered wife. Let's break down the events and actions that have actually brought us to this moment, and a breakdown in these, what is clearly a breakdown between Russian and Armenian relations. Obviously, the first one being the illegal blockade and the closing of the road in Lachin. And what's telling here is that no Russian state official has ever denounced the Aliyev regime for this closure. They've just asked for its opening and negotiations, and we know what negotiations mean. It means more concessions to both of them on terms that they want and things that they actually want from the Armenian government and not from the Artsakh government. Secondly is the fact that they most likely green-lighted the invasion of Armenia by the Aliyev regime in September. Third, they obviously refused to live up to their treaty obligations or were not even willing to denounce Aliyev's invasion for what it was, calling it border clashes and such. And most telling, a couple of weeks ago, they actually killed a UN resolution that would have called for the opening of the road and UN action and involvement in internationalizing this issue. And fifth, and most telling, was, this is an open secret, of the fact that they refused to deliver hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons that were purchased after the war, paid for. This is prior to the start of the Ukraine war, so there was no excuse of having shortages. And with the obvious purpose of trying to keep us weak and isolated and dependent on them. And all of this comes after 30 years that every government here, from post-independence on, depending, doesn't matter which regime it was, has actually made every major political decision based on what the Russian government would say, what they want, or whatever their positions would be on a particular issue. And I'll give you the two best examples, which was in 2014, where they actually forced us to join the Eurasian Union rather than the European Union that we were negotiating with for years, which in economic terms is sort of choosing a 1975 Lada over a BMW. Then let's move on to defense and military matters. Obviously, they had a red line. You cannot be dealing with NATO or Western powers and modernizing your military, buying weapons from them. All of the while, looking the other way, while Turkish NATO generals are actually running the Azeri army and actually invading Artsakh and Armenia, being led by NATO generals, while at the same time they've blown up half the world in Ukraine because of NATO's possible expansion into that country. In conclusion, in real terms, Armenia's turn to the West, which started after September 13th in significant ways, both openly and in many times underwater, politically that is, or diplomatically, was really not an option. In fact, it was the only option after what we know for a fact to be a very clear Moscow, Baku, Ankara axis and alliance. The choice was you either move west or you become a version of Belarus with cognac and apricots. Thank you for joining me in these sort of insights.